The full circle moment really happened when we landed and when I stepped off the plane, because it wasn't that long ago, just a few decades, when my parents stepped off a plane from India in the United States. And like many immigrants, they didn't really have much. They didn't know what the country had in store for them, and they felt like complete strangers in a strange land. And then here they are, just one generation later, watching their son step off a plane back to India, but not as their son, not as an Indian American, but as an official representative of the United States on the world stage.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Unmuted Moments, a podcast exploring the journey to finding and owning your voice. I'm your host, Ahis, and today I am excited to be joined by Sourav Bhowmick. He's based in Washington, D.C., and is the head of U.S. and North America Global Investor Services at Global Counsel, which is an advisory firm that helps investors and corporations navigate policy and political risk around the world. So I'm sure it's a very interesting time now navigating both U.S. domestic and foreign policy. Before his current role, Sourav spent 4 years at the U.S. Treasury, including serving as the chief of staff for the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. I've had many accomplished people on the show, but Sourav is the first guest who has worked at the highest level of federal government, including directly with Janet Yellen. And for those of you non-finance folks, she's a former Treasury Secretary and the former chair of the Federal Reserve. As a son of Indian immigrant, Sourav's story reached a powerful milestone when he returned to India, not as a visitor, but to represent the President of the United States, and I should say, I guess, the people of America. So this is what you could call a full circle moment, and a moment of legacy that was realized just within one generation. So we're not going to talk about politics or policy making today. We're going to focus on his journey as a child of immigrants, how he navigated high-stakes spaces, and the moments that's helped him find his voice. Sir, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great to have you. So let's start by getting to know your story from growing up. So can you tell us about your upbringing as a child of immigrants and how that shaped and influenced your voice?
Yeah, so as you said, I'm the proud son of two parents who immigrated to this country from India. And my upbringing was mostly in a really small town in southeastern Connecticut, which looks nothing like India. And you can count on one hand, actually, the number of families of South Asian descent anywhere in our vicinity. And so I just remember for the first 18 years of my life, just feeling very different. We were different because of how we spoke, how we looked, the cultural norms and values that we had. And so much of my life was just about seeing everything through that lens of not fitting in or not being an American or not being American enough. And at the same time, because there wasn't much of an Indian community where we grew up, I felt really disconnected from my Indian heritage. So I didn't feel Indian enough. And so it's this classic struggle of not feeling Indian, not feeling American. Who am I? And it's tough enough to answer questions about your own identity when you're in middle school and high school, but adding that kind of constant questioning about who you are to the mix made it really difficult to find confidence and in turn have a voice. I think by the time I got to middle school, I had two things going for me. One was that I realized I was a pretty good student. And then I also was a pretty good musician. And so in those two contexts, whether it was the classroom or the band room, I felt like I had, I want to say, earned the right to use my voice, which doesn't feel right now, but that's at least back then what gave me the permission to embrace my voice a little bit more. And then I think it kind of expanded a little bit beyond that through adjacent spaces, whether it was other extracurriculars or sports or student government. And so, I was very involved in those spaces. And if you were to look at my resume going into college, I checked all the boxes for what looked like a very socially adjusted kid. But it never really felt that way. It really only changed by the time I got to college, which is the first time I was in a more diverse setting, the first time where I saw a lot more people that looked like me. And that was really the first time that I could let my guard down and just breathe a sigh of relief and start feeling more like myself, whoever that was. But that was really where that long journey began to figure out who am I and what is my voice.
You said something that I want to double click on, this idea of being a socially adjusted kid. I guess any specific examples or stories like that 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 comes to mind when you think about those years about not maybe fully adjusting.
I just remember as a kid, there would be things like friends' birthday parties that were sleepovers. And those were things that I just was not allowed to attend. And I remember one year, a friend of mine had a sleepover party, and he specifically didn't invite me because he knew that I wasn't going to be able to go. And that kind of thing really hurt. And there were things like that throughout middle school and high school where I was just doing things based on what I knew to be normal, based on my culture, or what my parents believed to be normal based on their culture. And slowly you see those things manifesting in like you just feeling left out. And between that, other small indications that suggest, hey, you're a little different, or the things that you do are a little different, it just made me feel like I was kind of a constant outsider. And so no matter how much on paper I looked like I fit in, and maybe I did fit in, maybe a lot of my friends and the people around me did see me as one of them, it still never fully felt that way.
Even as a parent myself, this whole idea of like feeling left out is something that we keep in mind, like even through daycare and stuff. Like, is she by herself? Is she like socializing? Is she playing with the other kids? It's something that's at the top of mind for me. And as I hear your story too, as so you mentioned like college was that time for you where you felt more adjusted, where it was more diverse population. For me, it was reversed because I came here as an immigrant and I came here for college first. So that was like the first taste of America was through college. So that was the experience of feeling like I didn't belong or feeling like different. All of that journey or process, all of that for me happened in college. So business school was the flip for me. So business school was the point where I actually felt like, oh, like I'm comfortable. Oh, I'm just like everybody else. Oh, I belong here. Oh, I have a voice. So all of that sort of happened to me at the graduate school level. So this is just a very sort of interesting contrast. So the idea for this show is about voice. So we talk a lot about voice. And you mentioned some of the challenges that you had growing up. Actually, you mentioned before I go further, you mentioned band, which is very interesting. I didn't know that about you. So what instrument, what kind of music and what instruments did you play?
I play two and a half instruments, all of which were primarily self-taught. Then ultimately I did take some more formal lessons on, but the first was drums, so percussion, and then guitar. And then I learned a little bit of piano.
Impressive. Have you kept up since college?
I mean, drumming was one of my first passions. So it's a funny story. When I was in middle school, I really wanted to join the jazz band, and you have to audition on a drum set. And I didn't have a drum set, and we certainly didn't have the money to buy a drum set. And so I actually made one out of cardboard boxes that were in our basement. And so I practiced the song, and I taught myself how to figure it out on a set of cardboard drums. And then I somehow made it onto the jazz band. And then from there, I started taking more formal lessons on an actual drum set and got eventually much better at it. I will say with a small child now, it's hard to find time to head out to a drum set and have a jam session. But when I do, it's a lot of fun.
Awesome, awesome. And as we talked about, so college and finding your voice, like even within maybe college or even earlier, like was there any particular moment where you felt like you did find your voice, where you're like, okay, this is something that maybe in the past I wouldn't be able to do, I wouldn't feel confident enough to do, but now I feel like I have the confidence or I can do this and use my voice. Any sort of moments of like, say you found yourself or you just stepped into maybe a voice that you didn't know you had before?
I remember really early on in my career, actually, I had a colleague who told me a cautionary tale about when he was a very junior employee.
Mhm.
And he was talking about when he was basically asked to fly overseas to join a client meeting. And he went to the meeting. There were a lot of really senior people in the room. He was the most junior one. And he didn't say anything or participate in the meeting because he didn't think that was his role to do that. After the meeting, the CEO went to him and said, "Why didn't you say anything? You flew all the way halfway around the world to not say anything. You have something to contribute." And my colleague told me this story to, I think, encourage me to make sure that I did contribute my voice when it was the right time. And my takeaway from that was whether it was an informal, like internal meeting with colleagues or whether it was an external client meeting, it was always really important to come to those meetings having done some thinking about what I can contribute. Of course, it involved reading the room to figure out when was the right time to contribute those ideas. But, I remember there would be meetings where it'd be like an internal brainstorm and there'd be a lull. And I would raise my hand and offer an idea because it's something that I had thought of, I'd been thinking about, I'd prepared for. And so I could very then confidently share this idea that I was really excited about. And those kinds of things would get noticed, right? The senior member of the team would make a note of that. And the next time there was a project on a similar issue, they would have me in mind. And those kinds of things served as validation that if I put in the work to feel like I'm contributing good ideas and I've actually prepared and feel confident in how I can deliver those ideas, that helped pave the way to start using my voice more freely.
And it sounds like, so this was early in your professional career, like after college.
Yeah.
And as I think back on my own story, as I said, it took me a while. So past college, even past like the first few years of professional life, I still felt like in my shell. I didn't know when it was appropriate to speak. Because if we go to a meeting, I have my manager, my manager's manager, and all those big people in a room. And I'm like, what do I have to say additional if they're here speaking? And if no one told me beforehand, like, hey, by the way, we want you to speak. I thought if you want me to speak, like you would ask me to speak. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, but it takes a while to get to that point to then realize that, hey, just by being in the room, it means you have something to say. And a lot of people don't realize that often until, till more down the road in their career. And for me, as I mentioned, so business school was that time for me. And even after that, I did investment banking. And I would remember I would go to some meetings with some clients or I was supposed to be in a meetings with like a VP or director or whatnot. And sometimes my VP or director would just be tied up with something else and not show up. So I'll go to the room or go to the call and it'd just be me as an associate to be the highest person. I think that happened to me one time. I think I was able to like finagle my way through that one call. And like that was that moment for me. I'm like, and whenever I go to a room or go to any meeting, even if I'm not the highest person, I just assume like my higher up, something could happen and they could miss the meeting or they could just say, hey, can you take the meeting? So I always assume that I might be presenting that material, whatever type of meeting. If it's my team presenting, even if we have higher people in the room, I always assume I might be the one presenting the material. And it's helped me so far. Like I think it also makes you prepared because you're not just an onlooker, just going in to just sit down there and take notes. So it does obviously require more time to prep for those meetings, but like you never quite flat footed. So you started your career in the private sector and eventually moved to the public sector. So what sort of pulled you or made you make that shift to want to go into public service?
Yeah, I think there were a couple different pulls actually. I knew that it was a long held dream to maybe one day get to do something like this, but I never really thought about it as a career. But the different pulls that I think eventually got me there. The first one is when I was growing up, I heard a lot of stories about my grandfathers on both sides of my family. On my mom's side, my grandfather was a forest ranger in India, where his job was to protect really remote villages from predatory animals. And on my dad's side, my grandfather was very involved in the Indian independence movement. And so I would always hear stories about his courage and sacrifice. And I think I never really connected the dots, but it kind of planted some latent seeds about the virtues of service. The second poll was actually my first day of business school.
Mm.
So, the first day at the Kellogg School of Management, our dean, Sally Blount, is addressing the entire class. And she said something that I thought was really profound. She said, the capital markets are highly efficient, but they're neither kind, just, or wise. And it's up to brave leaders to make up for those gaps. And here we are embarking on this MBA journey, to really, it's capitalism 101. But on the first day, our dean is calling us to action saying, yeah, the system exists and it's what we use and it's what works, but there's some serious flaws and you guys need to figure it out. And so I think business school was a time of a lot of reflection. I remember talking actually to a classmate who had this really sharp insight. And she said, private sector is really good at addressing symptoms of a lot of those flaws, but public policy is often the most direct way to treat the root causes. And so that really stuck with me. And then the last poll was actually during the COVID pandemic. So my wife, who's a physician, she was a doctor in the Bronx during COVID. And the Bronx was just one of the epicenters of the pandemic. And she was just doing heroic work on the front lines day in and day out. She was leading these emergency response teams in the makeshift ICUs, and she was coming home every single night exhausted at like 3 a.m. And I was also up doing work at 3 a.m., but it was work that was very different. And, one of those nights she's coming home and I look at my computer and the PowerPoint slide in front of me. And I remember thinking to myself, whatever skills and passions and talents I have in my life, I need to use them towards a higher calling. And that basically kicked off a year of introspection, a year of soft exploration for what could be other types of more mission driven or service oriented work. I knew I wanted to combine my general management skill set with my growing interest in economic inequality, how to make our capital system better and more inclusive. And then lo and behold, somehow I still can't explain it. About a year later, I get a phone call asking me to be a presidential appointee working under Janet Yellen at the Treasury Department. And so that was a no brainer. So I moved out to Washington, D.C.
Was this like someone you had a prior relationship with, or you worked with in a former role or prior role?
It's a combination of a number of different relationships and a number of different experiences that really all came together in the course of about a week. Really, my goal was never to land a specific job or to work in the administration. My goal was to talk to enough people that knew what my skill set was and knew the types of things that I wanted to do so that one day, if the right role did open up, maybe someone would think of me. And it just so happened that the right people did think of me. And presidential administration hiring is a really complicated beast, but a lot of different miracles worked together in a short amount of time that allowed me the opportunity that I had.
Awesome. As I say, luck comes to people who are prepared. But as you went through your story about what pulled you into public service, two things that resonate with me. Obviously, the MBA, it sounds like this is like a commercial for MBA. I talked about how MBA was instrumental in my own journey and also how that was instrumental for you as well. By the way, for listeners, if you do have any questions about business school, about Kellogg, you can reach out to us offline. I'm sure Sir will be happy to answer questions as well. You also mentioned your spouse. So at the time, we were actually in Chicago. My wife was a resident at Northwestern Memorial at the time. She was in the final year or getting close to, I think she was in the final year of her emergency medicine residency at the time. So just want to say shout out to the spouse and especially for those who worked through the COVID times. I know those times were rough. I know those days, like every like 6 o'clock, people would all be clapping, but like some of those things that they go through still exist today. They are still like putting themselves on harm's way. And I don't see a lot of those appreciation that we showed during those early days of COVID. So let's talk about your time now at the Treasury. So you got the job or got the offer. And what went through those first few days or first few months? And how did you get acclimatized into this new environment of one, coming from private to government, and two, just being part of this historic organization that has so much influence in not just the US economy, but also just the global economy?
Well, that first day going to the Treasury Department was just surreal. So the Treasury Department is the only federal agency that's on the same grounds as the White House. It's right next door to it. So you walk in past these big black metal gates that say White House on them. You go past the Secret Service, and then there's this pathway that has the Treasury on one side and the White House on the other. You can kind of reach out, feel like you can touch them. And this pathway is lined with trees and it's adorned with these American flags. And it just gives you goosebumps, like seeing all of that around you. And so you're walking in, and then I remember on that first day going up these really tall set of steps to get into the building. You then go into the building. It's really high ceilings, really wide hallways. It feels a lot more like a museum than an actual workplace. But I think it hits you pretty quickly that the physical scale of this building is a reflection of the magnitude of the work that you get to do there. And so it was pretty evident to me right away that this was a privilege to get to do this kind of work. And I had to make sure that I gave it my all and that I did the best work that I possibly could in however much time I would get at the Treasury Department. And so I felt like just immediately this sense of purpose and focus walking in. And then I remember later on that first day meeting Secretary Yellen in person for the first time. I remember thinking that I was going to be completely starstruck and it would just be a blur. But I remember really clearly going to her office and talking to her because it just had this clarity of mission. And so throughout the entire 4 years at Treasury, there were a lot of really good days, there were a lot of really tough days, but on every single day, it ends with you walking down that pathway to exit the building and you see the flags, and then it brings back those goosebumps. And so that intensity of that first day really carried with me and sustained me for all 4 years. In terms of the difference between the private sector and the public sector, I mean, a lot of differences that I was expecting, differences I wasn't expecting. But I found that my MBA and management consulting skill set was actually hugely complementary to the work that many of the folks who hadn't worked in the private sector were doing. So I felt pretty immediately that there was a lot of value in what I was bringing. And I felt that, there actually could have been more that government could have gained with more folks who had similar backgrounds.
So right from your very first day, you actually said you had a meeting with Janet Yellen at the time?
Yeah, so I was a part of her direct staff. So I was
Oh,
the
wow.
deputy executive secretary. So my job was to manage the briefing process and information flow directly for the secretary and really to enable her decision making. So it involved working with her and being a part of her core team.
That's an amazing story. I think that's exactly, I guess, the definition of American dream. To come from the background that you came from Indian parents, to being in Washington, D.C., and working with some of the most, or not some of, she's probably one of the most powerful people in America at the time. So that's just an amazing story. Did you feel any sense of, I don't know, imposter syndromes? Without even dealing with her directly, dealing with colleagues, I imagine colleagues from all parts of the country, different backgrounds. Like, how was that feeling? Like, did you feel any way, any shape, any sort of imposter syndrome, or do I belong here, or what am I doing here? If you did, and how did you overcome those?
My imposter syndrome was off the charts. I remember one of those people who helped me get my foot in the door at Treasury. I remember texting her about it before going to Treasury, thinking, I don't know if I can do this. I've never experienced such intense imposter syndrome because I've had the chance to be a part of so many different elite institutions, either where I went to school or where I worked. I've experienced a lot of imposter syndrome, but Treasury was certainly going to be the highest. But what I found every time I experienced imposter syndrome was that I was always able to conquer it because what I did every single time was, someone would say something smart. And so I would just put them on a pedestal and think, okay, this person is just universally smart at
Smart.
everything, right? Or they did something really well. So I just assumed they're incredibly skilled across the board. And then through time, whether it's minutes, hours, days, weeks, you realize, okay, these people are human. And some of the things that they're not great at, maybe I'm really good at. And I think Janet Yellen, for as brilliant as she is, she'll be the first person to tell you that there are things that she doesn't do well. And that's why she has a team. That's why she has a staff and she relies on them to bring their strengths. And what that experience taught me was that we all have different strengths to bring to the table. That's why we're at the table.
That's awesome. I think this is a great, great point for people listening. This whole idea of, I guess, universality and expertise. Because I used to think the same way too. Like somebody said something very brilliant, or someone is good at this particular thing, and then we all just assume like, oh my goodness, like this person is just like a master at everything they do. So I think it's a very good insight to keep that at the back of your mind. Like, yes, this person is good at that one thing. I also could be good at something, maybe not the same thing. So if I'm not good at this thing that, say, I am not good at this one thing that you are good at, doesn't mean like I suck. Right? You get good at something when you do the thing over and over and over again. Reps, like, right? Whether you are an investment banker, whether you're a consultant, whether you're a doctor or physician, right? If you see more patients, you get better at diagnosis, the more patients you see. So I really, really appreciate that perspective. So let's fast forward to your actual day-to-day work. So you ended up leading one of the biggest policy rollouts, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. So what was that learning curve? And also, I guess let's also talk about the leadership part, not just like leading, but like leading an organization that has like impact in like real world people.
Yeah. So that was a role that I took on about 2 years into my time at Treasury. And I took that role on immediately after coming back from paternity leave after the birth of my daughter. And so there was a learning curve for so many reasons. Number one was I was returning to work after a while of being a parent. Two, I was returning to work in a new role. And three, I was returning to work as a working parent for the first time. And those were just three really big things that all happened at once that made that learning curve exceptionally steep. Now, before I took on this role, the Inflation Reduction Act had been passed and it had been a part of my portfolio when I was in the secretary's office. And so I had spent a lot of time on the IRA. I felt like I knew the policies pretty well. And then I learned on my first day in the new role that I was just an inch deep and a mile wide, and that there's so much of it that I just did not realize existed. Like there's the how much you know, and how much you don't know, how much you don't even know you don't know. There was just so much, and honestly, I think those first 6 months in that role, anyone who worked with me could probably see that I was struggling. There was just so much substance and content and depth to get through. I think the reason that I eventually got there though was that the subject matter was really important to me. So the Inflation Reduction Act was a huge climate and clean energy bill. And it played a tremendous role in trying to create a future that does something about climate change. And I found that to be motivating so that when there were the late nights and weekends trying to get up to speed and learn about the policies I didn't know enough about, that was giving me the motivation to keep going. And so for me, the learning curve was less about managing a team. I felt like I had done that previously in my career. Again, the MBA was very helpful. And so the learning curve in this case was really more about the subject matter, which was entirely new to me.
Part of what you learn or what we learn in business school is how to influence people. So just in terms of like how to influence people, as a leader specifically, like was there any difference between how you did that in your previous life compared to like how that played out in government?
So yes and no. I think relationship building was always important and something I focused on in the private sector. It appears a little differently in the public sector in that any kind of decision making in government has to be really consensus driven, or at least that's how it historically has been. And so, in order to get anything through, you need to bring a lot of people along to the table, whether that's something very internally within a small office at Treasury, or whether that's something really broad. You're talking about external stakeholders and coalitions, the real world too. And so it's really important that you manage those relationships and bring people along because that was the only way to actually get decisions through. And that was something that I just did not realize about government. A lot of folks had previewed that to me, but I didn't really fully comprehend it or appreciate it until I got there. We're seeing that model change a bit, especially at the federal level in the current administration, where there is more of a unilateral decision-making approach, and we'll see what that means for future administrations. But I think by and large, across government, whether it's in the US or around the world, that consensus approach, I think, is core tenet.
How do you carry that now in your current role back in the private sector? Like, how are those skills and experiences that you've had during those 4 years? How has that translated for you? Or what are some of those things that you think, hey, like I can really do this now because of this experience?
One of the things that I didn't really appreciate about the experience at Treasury until I left was how much that really expanded my policy network beyond the things that I worked on. And so in my day to day now, I come across really obscure policy issues that I had not ever really thought about before, well outside of Treasury's purview. But through different groups or affiliations I was a part of during my time at Treasury, during the most random interagency convenings, I had developed a pretty broad network of folks who are experts in really arcane issues. And so it's incredible that, a very strange topic will come up, but oddly enough, I'll know someone who ran that office and I can talk to them and get their thoughts on a specific thing. It's one of those reminders that a place like Washington, D.C. is very small. And so I think the experience was great in developing a network and deepening my network, especially complementing the network that I already built in the private sector prior to my time in government.
Awesome. One powerful lesson that come to mind as I listen to you too is just, I guess, the power within networks. Whether you was early in your career, your mid level, and sometimes you just never know when you might need help from someone. And I think, as they say, like whenever you have a chance to be nice to somebody, it doesn't have to always have to be like people who you work closely with, right? Just people who you interact on a day to day basis, because you really never know when you might have to call on somebody to help with something or to ask some arcane questions. Let's fast forward now to this one moment I mentioned briefly at the top of the show about you going to making a trip to India to represent the US and how that was a full circle moment being a child of Indian immigrant. Like just take us through the moments. I guess one, why were you there? What did you do while you were there and accomplish while you were there? And what was that moment like for not just you, but also your family?
So in 2023, the G20 summit was held in India, and I had the opportunity to join Secretary Yellen as part of Treasury's official delegation to the summit. As you can imagine, something like the G20, there's a lot of bilateral meetings that she's having with her counterparts, and the information that she needs for those meetings is changing on a real time basis. And so my job was to be that central clearinghouse for all the information the secretary would need to be able to conduct those meetings and achieve our policy objectives. So I was asked to be a part of this trip. It's an official government delegation. And so what happens is you show up to Andrews Air Force Base, you get escorted to the tarmac, and there's this big blue and white plane that says United States of America and those iconic letters on it. And it's, again, surreal. You walk into the plane, and it's not just any plane, though. It's one that's going to India. It's going back to where the story started. And I'd say there was one and a half full circle moments. The half full circle, so I guess the half circle, was the actual plane ride, which I wasn't expecting to take this path, but it actually flew directly above Connecticut, where I grew up. And I remember chuckling. I haven't fully processed what the metaphor was, but I remember thinking that was interesting and funny coincidence. But the full circle moment really happened when we landed and when I stepped off the plane, because it wasn't that long ago, just a few decades, when my parents stepped off a plane from India in the United States. And like many immigrants, they didn't really have much. They didn't know what the country had in store for them, and they felt like complete strangers in a strange land. And then here they are just one generation later, watching their son step off a plane back to India, but not as their son, not as an Indian American, but as an official representative of the United States on the world stage. So if there were ever any questions that our family felt about our belonging or our acceptance in America, that moment was the answer. And so it was a moment of just, I think, immense pride for me and my family, not just for any kind of achievement that it represented, but I think really just pride in America and pride in being Americans, because I really can't think of anywhere else in the world where something like that is possible in the span of just a single lifetime.
As you went through the story, I felt some goosebumps myself. I don't think you could get any more the American dream than that. And for all its problems, I still definitely 100% agree with you. Like, even from my own story, I don't think it'll be possible. When I applied to college, like, my dad passed when I was young, but like my mom couldn't even afford like an application fee for a US college, for example. And so that's how it started. And there's a whole story, which I think I might do a separate episode about that whole story, actually. But it's just remarkable how people, you hear different stories of people coming to America with like 20 bucks in your pocket and all that stuff, and then it becomes something. And for you, it even take you to another level where not just becoming something in America, you actually you got to the point where you could represent America abroad, and even more special, to represent America in the land where your parents came from. So, anyways, kudos to you. Shout out to your parents for raising someone to get to a point like this, to be able to represent this country and represent this country well. So, in the middle of your time in the Treasury, you had your daughter. You've mentioned the birth and how you switched jobs, I guess, coming from paternity leave. And you mentioned, I think you've also posted elsewhere about how you were helping manage a banking crisis one weekend, and the next time you became a dad. So, I'm just curious, sort of how that's all happened. That one particular moment, I guess the time leading up to the birth of your daughter, managing that, and then all of a sudden, like, managing the responsibilities of being a new dad.
So actually, all three of those things, the India trip,
Oh,
the
oh,
banking
really? Oh,
crisis,
even
and
more
the birth of
impressive.
my daughter. Yeah, I mean, all three of those things happened in the course of about a month. So it was a very emotionally charged month in our household. But yeah, actually, so my wife was 38 weeks pregnant. We were looking forward to one of our final weekends as just the two of us before our daughter would join the picture. And as that week is progressing, there's some rumblings about a potential bank crisis happening. And we get closer to Thursday, Friday. It looks like there's a major regional bank that's going to collapse. I wake up on Saturday to just a flurry of emails, and it's pretty clear to me that I'm going to be spending that weekend at the Treasury building helping prepare Treasury's response to this. This was the regional banking crisis in 2023, where there was a lot of tumult, I would say, within a handful of banks. And of course, the concern was, would that lead to an overall crisis in the broader US banking system? And then from there, potentially even the global banking system. And so the stakes were incredibly high. And so that was probably one of the most intense 48, 72-hour periods in my professional career, just running around trying to figure out what we were going to do, how to make sure we were enabling the system to be able to have those policy interventions happen. And it was just a complete marathon of a weekend. The good news was that we were able to put in place a number of policy interventions alongside the banking regulators that helped prevent the worst outcome, but it was a really grueling process. But then, of course, the next weekend began another marathon, which was Parenthood. And that was it's really special. I mean, of course, the birth of your firstborn child is just, there's nothing like it. But that started the journey of parenthood, which I often describe as a series of a lot of lows. But every now and then you get these highs, right? Whether it's your kid smiling at you for the first time or learning a new skill. And when you experience those highs, there's just nothing like it. And it makes all the lows worth it. And so that's all to say, during my 4 years at Treasury, I feel like I got to live a lot of life and enjoy a lot of life's really high moments. So when my last day finally came, which was on bittersweet terms because we were voted out of office, but when that last day came and I was packing up, I remember thinking to myself, okay, I got to live out a really wild dream. Now I need to channel my energies towards my daughter's dreams, whatever those are, whenever they become.
So it's talking about dream, and it's come up a couple of times. We talked about the American dream a couple of times here. So what is that? As you think about to legacy, especially for your daughter, for example, she's going to be I guess second generation. So what does that American dream mean to you now? And also, what would you want that to look like for like the next generation, like your daughter, for example?
I think the American dream has a few different components to it. The first one is about identity. And I think it's about finding your place in America, because it's not the American dream unless you feel like you're an American. And it's really hard to feel American, I think. But I think everyone has a really unique personal story, whether you've been here for generations or whether you've been here for a minute. There's something really unique about your story and how that fits into the broader American story. And figuring that out is hard, but I think it's a necessary component to feel like you've realized an American dream. The second part to me, I think, is the more obvious part, which is about social and economic mobility. I think there are things that are very unique about America in terms of its freedom and opportunities, which of course are things that I think many immigrants could be questioning these days. But that unique combination of freedom and opportunity is what allows people to make a better life for themselves. But then the third part, I think, is the most critical one, which is if you can achieve that dream, it's incomplete unless you're using that dream for the greater good. Because there's a myth out there that the American dream is something that you can just achieve on your own and by yourself. And that's just not true, because a lot of different forces have to work together to make something like that happen, whether it's people who are around you or different institutions or resources. And so you have a responsibility to pay that back. It's not just about enriching yourself. And that's why I think it's actually not a coincidence that in the Biden administration, we had a record number of first and second generation Americans who were serving in that administration, because these were people who in their lifetime have seen the promise of the American dream delivered. And so they feel this indebtedness and a desire to give that back. And that is a part of what, I know this isn't a political podcast, but that's a part of what I find so upsetting about some of the sentiment around immigrants in America today. Because in my experience, it's immigrants that are among the most proud to be American. They're the ones who are among the most proud and feel the greatest sense of responsibility to continue to make this country better.
Yeah, because even from my own experience, like a lot of immigrants have experienced worse situations. They know what it means to have the opportunities that you have now, and they take it seriously. Like it's a privilege, especially for people who left, families behind. Like on a day-to-day basis. You talk to them, you hear about the stuff they're going through, and you feel that privilege to want to do better, to want to contribute, to make this place better. But there's one thing you said at the beginning of your explanation about like you have to feel American to pursue the American dream. That's very powerful. I don't think I've thought about this sort of American dream concept like from that perspective. And for a lot of immigrants right now, obviously with the current environment right now, that's sometimes challenging to feel like that. Like this is the place where I'm going to be for the rest of my life, or this is the place where I'm going to contribute my efforts to make this a place better. You're hearing people saying or questioning, even for people who are citizens or permanent resident, questioning and like, okay, am I even American? And to be honest, I'll be very honest here. Like I became a citizen about 5 years ago, and I've had some times, and I'm like, huh, do I even count as an American? And I imagine there's a lot of people now too who, even if you're privileged too, right? You could have a great job and be privileged financially speaking. Those sentiments still like we still live in this environment. Like you cannot escape from those sentiments. And hopefully, as they say, like the clock, what's it, the pendulum swings. But hopefully we can get to a point again where like everybody can feel like they really belong and everybody can feel like they really can contribute towards making this place better for everyone. A lot of people who are listening to the show are going to be international students or maybe they're recent graduates and that kind of thing, who are thinking like, okay, what can I do? Or how like do I become more American? What advice would you say for somebody who's struggling, who is in that that's the stage of life who whether it's trying to get a visa, whether it's trying to get a job and just feeling like that sense of not belonging in this place. I don't know do you have any advice for that kind of person in that situation?
I think something about the American dream, since that's what we're talking about, is that it's not something you can take for granted, and it's something that has required a lot of very intense and intentional action for it to continue to be accessible to folks. If you think about things like women's suffrage or civil rights or the disability movement, those were all movements that tried to expand access to that dream. And those things did not happen in a vacuum. Those things did not happen spontaneously. Those required a lot of organization, a lot of ambition to be able to keep America's promise alive and to be able to expand that promise to more people. And so I think my message to new Americans is that you've got to be civically engaged. Whether you're a citizen or not, you've got to be a part of what's around you. I know it's really tempting to just want to focus on the thing that's right in front of you, whatever the immediate goal is. And especially when you're coming and maybe you're experiencing financial hardship, right? The main focus is on food and shelter, right? But I think in addition to that, you've got to look up and you've got to look around and figure out where you are needed in your community. And it can look a number of different ways. It can be as small as getting to know the people around you and being present in your neighborhoods and community. It can be even larger. It can be getting directly involved in trying to shape and influence public policy. But you need those agents of change to not give up and to keep striving. And you've got to realize that, you can't just count on someone else to do that for you. You've got to be a part of that movement with them.
Okay, the one thing that sort of came to mind, obviously, with again in the current environment, like a lot of people are kind of scared to do anything, right? Even in the past, if it's like, I remember when I lived in New York, there'd be a lot of protests and stuff, and I would just jump on the street and all that kind of stuff. But now, I imagine a lot of people could have like causes that they fundamentally agree with or like they're passionate about and don't pursue. But especially like for immigrants, they feel like, maybe I should not go on the street, or maybe I should not do this, or maybe I should not do. I don't want to put my name out there because obviously, like, I don't want to get the attention of the wrong people or the wrong agency of government, that kind of thing. So what are some ways, maybe not going on the streets to protest, like what are other ways to be civically minded that could make a potential impact?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I totally hear what you're saying about some of this need to self-censor because of the very real repercussions that could happen. And that's why I think in these kinds of situations, it's incumbent on people who do have agency to do a lot of that speaking, right? And that's where someone like me would fall in, where, I've been able to get to a place where I can feel comfortable about my voice. I can feel comfortable about the safety nets that I would have in those kinds of situations. And so whether it's people like me or whether it's people who are elected officials or people who have that kind of agency, it's really those folks who need to carry a lot of the water. But again, these folks can't carry the water in a vacuum. A lot of what informs the things that they are going to fight for and the things that they're going to say happens at the grassroots. So maybe a really tactical example is going to town halls or community meetings or getting involved in some kind of political campaign or whatever it is, some kind of vehicle that can help transfer your ideas from just inside your head into a broader platform. And so you don't need to have a front and center role, but you can have a different kind of role that still gets that message to the right folks who can then carry it on your behalf. So I think that's one way to do it. But I completely agree with you. It's a really difficult time and it's a really difficult question to directly answer.
In terms of like being civil minded, one thing that people always say is like write a letter or call your senator's office. I don't think I've ever written a letter to my senator or like call the office. I don't know if you have any experience with those type of things. Do those things ever work? I always wonder when people say that, I'm like, does that work? Do you have an experience with that type of thing?
I remember when I was in high school, I wrote a letter to my congressman and he wrote back and he
Oh,
actually signed it himself and
oh
left a
really?
note saying, thank you for
Oh wow.
reaching out to this important issue. I'll say at the Treasury Department, I remember there's a famous example of someone who, I think it was a student who reached out to Janet Yellen. This might have been when she was in the Fed, but reached out to her about a really specific question that he was really excited about and she returned the email. I think she even met with this person at some point. And so, there's a lot of volume coming in, but look, those things actually do influence how policy gets made. A big part of government is about public comment and stakeholder input. And so we, at least when we were running the IRA office, for example, a big part of our job was being in communities and trying to hear directly from folks about what their needs were. And that certainly informed our policy approach. Do we get everything exactly right? No. But are there mechanisms in place to listen? Absolutely.
Okay, that's very encouraging to know. So we are getting towards the end of the conversation now. I feel like we could keep going on and on, but just a couple of more questions. What's one thing you hope listeners take away from your story?
I think it's this idea that we are all a part of something bigger. And it's really tempting in this day and age to not want to think of things that way. It's really tempting to just look out for number one and just focus on the thing in front of you. But I genuinely believe that the reason that we exist as a society is because we recognize that when we come together, that actually results in better outcomes for everyone. And what I worry about is that as time progresses, we're turning more and more inward and not outward in the way that I think we need to do. And what I would encourage people to do is to find things that you care about, things that make you interested in others' well being beyond just your own. Maybe you're interested in knitting and you can find a group around you who's also interested in knitting. And in doing so, you develop relationships with people outside of your immediate circle and you start caring about those people. And then you start caring about what's good for those people and how that might be different from what is good for you, but that's a cost that you can take because you recognize it's better for everyone. I really want and hope that we can work towards a world where people start thinking less about the direct negative impact to them and the direct benefit to others, because that can actually lift more people up together. That's been something that I spend a lot of my time thinking about and thinking about what I can do to help people think that way. But it's certainly a challenge.
Now, thank you for coming and sharing your story. I hope it inspires people listen today. Always my final question is, what's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Best piece of advice I ever received was actually a really bad piece of advice.
Ah,
And
okay.
it helped me change my perspective on advice in general.
Okay.
This was advice from a CEO who I really respected. And this was several years ago. They basically encouraged me to just take a bunch of risks because I was young and that I would be fine. This person who was giving me this advice was someone who, yeah, that is advice that worked for them. They took a lot of risks that worked out for them. But they also were someone who came from a very well-to-do family. They had financial support. They had a social safety net in a way that I did not. And so, well, for this person, if they took a risk and it didn't pan out, they would be fine. If I took a risk, I could be out in the streets if it didn't pan out for me. And so what that told me was that, okay, advice does not come from equal sources. You got to think about who's giving you the advice, what circumstances that they're in, what constraints that you're in, how their lived experience differs from yours. And then you got to be really selective about which pieces you actually take with you. Now, I didn't take that person's full advice, but the way that they talked about risk, I thought was actually interesting. And that has helped me think about risk and the evolution of my thinking on risk through time. So that part was helpful, but I didn't take the full piece of advice. And so what I tell folks, especially as they're listening to me right now, if parts of what I'm saying are coming from things that are not consistent with the circumstances you're living in, don't listen. Adjust, take something else out of it. But I think being judicious about the advice that you accept and the advice that you act on is important.
There's a very powerful context here because I haven't thought about it that way, but you're very right there. Something it could be powerful advice to one person, but not so much to the next person. So again, I'm really appreciative of your time. Thank you for spending your Friday afternoon here on the show. And thank you for all those who are listening today. Please go subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. I'm Mahis, and until next time, stay unmuted.